In this video, we are going to be reviewing cellular respiration. The first slide shows us a wonderful overview of the process of both cellular respiration and photosynthesis. Now, these two processes work hand in hand, as you can see. We're going to start over on the right here with the glucose. So this comes in the form of energy that organisms such as ourselves, heterotrophs, take in through various sources. Other molecules could be considered here, fats and proteins, of course, but glucose is the preferred fuel, so to say, for this process. So we're going to take a look at glucose, or they have glucose, that's sugar, in this diagram. That's combined with oxygen. This process is the reason you take in oxygen is due to this process of cellular respiration. And we'll see oxygen come into play as we go through the steps of cellular respiration. But these are the two major reactants. And all of this occurs, or I can say most of this occurs, in the mitochondria of your cells. And as a result, we produce a wonderful molecule called adenosine triphosphate. It is the molecule that allows us to accomplish cellular work of all types. It is the energy currency of the cell. Okay, so we take energy in the form of our foods, glucose, fats, and proteins, and we convert it into this usable form of energy that we can use in our cells. All right, now the products of cell respiration are water. We'll see that as we move through the steps. And also carbon dioxide. And as you can see with this beautiful circle of life, I like to call it, the reactants for photosynthesis are the products of cell respiration. So we take carbon dioxide and water in photosynthesis, and using energy from the sun, plants, organisms that are autotrophic, making their own food in the form of glucose, take these two major reactants and another major reactant, sun, and make the glucose. And as a byproduct, oxygen. So it's a beautiful system, just beautiful. Oh, okay, let's move on. So cellular respiration, major reactants and major products are very important for us to understand. And we take a look at the major reactants we've already talked about, the glucose and the oxygen, and then through a series of several steps, or actually three major steps we'll talk about, we end up with major products being carbon dioxide, water, and then of course adenosine triphosphate. Now there are other reactants, there are other products that we'll see throughout this process, but this is the overall reaction, and you must know this overall reaction. I'm not going to ask you about the coefficients here. I just want you to know the major reactants and major products. Now, something we have to discuss or mention before we move on is reactions called redox reactions. Something is reduced or something is also oxidized at the same time. So when something is reduced, it is gaining electrons. And when something is oxidized, it's losing electrons. I have this wonderful mnemonic down here. Leo, hello Leo. Leo, he's a tiger and he says go. So lose electrons, oxidation. Gain electrons, reduction. So let's take a look at that in this cellular respiration process. So here we have our glucose, and electrons are being pulled. Electrons are being taken away from the glucose, and they are being put on to the carbon dioxide eventually through this series of steps in this process. And then we have oxygen, which is going to be gaining electrons. There it is. And it is reduced to water. At the very end of the process, we'll actually see that step. So something is always in a redox reaction. One molecule is oxidized and another one is reduced. You're just shuffling electrons from one molecule to another. Okay, so remember Leo the tiger says grr, and it always will help you remember oxidation versus reduction. Right, so cellular respiration, again, major products and reactants are important. And this idea of how electrons are pulled from glucose. There is an enzyme, and you might have recognized this as an enzyme, being as though it has an ASE at the end. That is a very common naming scheme for our enzymes. And this is the enzyme that actually physically pulls the electrons from glucose. And it does that and pulls those electrons in the form of the hydrogen atoms. So it actually pulls an electron and a proton from glucose and puts them onto a wonderful coenzyme called nicotinamide. It's actually a B vitamin, a type of B vitamin, and it puts that hydrogen atom and another electron onto our NAD+ to make the reduced form. Again, when you gain electrons, you're reducing into NADH. And this is a wonderful electron carrier. It's going to carry the electrons to the final stage in the process. And that is where those electrons are going to be used in the process of making ATP. But let's take a look at this transfer of hydrogen atoms from glucose. So there is some glucose, especially in the bun of this hamburger, let's say. And we have lots of hydrogen atoms on the glucose molecule in that hamburger bun. And there's our enzyme in purple. And the coenzyme, this is the molecular formula or molecular structure of nicotinamide. Again, in its oxidized form, it's missing some electrons here, hence the plus. Because remember, electrons are negative. So the dehydrogenase pulls 2 hydrogen atoms at a time. So a hydrogen atom, remember, is an electron and a proton. Hydrogen has an atomic number of 1. Atomic number is the number of protons. And in a stable or neutral form of hydrogen, you would have 1 electron. So it pulls off 2 electrons and 2 hydrogens, and it is going to place them onto or transfer them or give them to its coenzyme, NAD+, nicotinamide. Now, NAD+, how do we make that just NAD? Well, we'd have to add 1 electron. Okay, so we add 1 electron and NAD. Okay, now we have 1 electron and 2 protons. How do we make this NADH? Well, we have to have an H, which is hydrogen, 1 electron, 1 proton. So what do we have left after this process? Well, we have 2 electrons going to NAD+ and 1 hydrogen ion from those hydrogen atoms to make NADH. And we'll have 1 hydrogen left over as a result. Okay? And that process is detailed in this series of steps at the bottom here too. All right, so again, we're transferring electrons. These are high energy electrons from glucose to this coenzyme, which becomes the NADH electron carrier. It is going to carry electrons to that final step of cellular respiration, and we're going to use those electrons to do some amazing work. And that work is making some ATP. All right. So another important aspect here before we move on to looking at the 3 stages of cellular respiration is understanding mitochondrial structure. I cannot emphasize this enough. You must understand the structure in order to understand how this process plays out. So the mitochondria, as you might have remembered from Chapter 6 in your studies of the organelles in Chapter 6. Mitochondria has 2 membranes, an outer and an inner membrane. Okay, and that's shown here, outer and this inner membrane. And the inner membrane is highly folded. And these folds increase the surface area for cellular respiration to occur. And in particular, that last step of cellular respiration. And these folds are called cristae, and there are 2 spaces Just inside the outer membrane, before you get to the inner membrane, there is a space called the intermembrane space. And then if you go through the inner membrane, you will hit another space, and that inner space is called the matrix. Very important to understand how these are oriented. So if we were starting outside of the mitochondria and the cytoplasm, we would first hit the outer membrane, and then we would be in the intermembrane space. Look around, can you see it? Okay. And then below you would be the inner membrane, and then you could burrow through the inner membrane into this other space called a matrix, or the matrix. Okay.